Resisting your inner self will just lead to an explosion, followed by shame and sadness. Let me try to explain what I mean. What is your inner self? I could call it also your highest being, your God self, your essence, or the source from which all your desires basically come. What does resistance mean? Well, that's very tricky because most acts of resistance, they would seem like they are actually the opposite from resistance. I call these cope. For instance, say Bob is trying to make a shit ton of money, and as a result, he is successful, or at least seen as successful by society. The source of his problem was an inner split that occurred when he found out, or he thought he found out, that he is only lovable when he achieves material success, which propelled him into a mode where to achieve success, he would have to keep resisting love as a way or as a means to stay successful. But even then, he will feel empty inside. That would be due to resisting the love that he actually wants, because he feels like he only deserves it when he is successful and showing how amazingly successful he can become. What do I mean by explosion? As I said, it will lead to an explosion. The explosion will happen when Bob is forced into a corner. He is confronted with a dead end. His coping approach is no longer viable. His means of achieving success, which is for achieving love, is no longer able to fulfill him, or never really was. Let's say Bob finds out at some point that he hasn't really become any happier from the time he was studying compared to now, where he's really successful, making lots of money. He might buy himself short bursts of happiness via buying material goods or fun activities. And he argues that he's better off than those who are fighting for survival. But now that he has come as far as he can get by his material success approach, he feels no better than, say, 10 years prior. This will inevitably lead to an existential crisis. Bob went all in with his approach, but it never really achieved his underlying desires. The underlying desire, of which material success was just a means to get. His desire was love. He can still keep sailing the dead boat on which he is sailing at the moment, but this is not a viable long-term strategy. The boat will sink, or Bob will become terribly depressed, because he has to suppress his insight of the fact that his coping strategy never really achieved what he wanted to achieve, that is, feeling loved. As I said, the result is shame and sadness. Why sadness? The sadness will come when Bob realizes that he has actually never achieved anything, leading him to feel just as unloved as he always was, but 10 years older. The shame will come from realizing that this realization that he always felt as unloved within the past 10 years was always there, but he was too cowardly to look. He always kind of knew, but Bob thought that he would probably get away with his approach and maybe eventually realize that it was all good. But he kind of knew that it wasn't. Any hint along the way about this realization would trigger in him an adverse reaction, making him look the other way. He didn't want to feel the existential crisis, so it was delayed until Bob was backed into a corner. The explosion always just was necessary because of his weakness to look, and thus Bob might feel like he actually deserves all his sadness, and he feels ashamed. Back to the original quote. Resisting your inner self will just lead to an explosion, followed by shame and sadness. But there is hope. Because Bob has always honed his skills, his really valuable skills. So it's not like he starts at zero like a preschooler or something like that. Bob has not become worthless or worth less than anybody else. He has honed his skills, but just used them in the wrong way. He has also learned that he can achieve success, and thus now he can use them to do good. His conception of good, his deeper conception of good. He will have to work on his felt lack of self-worth or love still. But that's a different story.